Welcome back to ThinkTech. This is Keeping the World Company. I'm Jay Fidell. We are going to talk about exactly what the aftermath is to the Prigozhin-Wagner group insurrection. And what is Putin doing to recover from that insurrection? And will he be able to retain the level of power that he had before? With my co-host, Tim Apicella, our special esteemed guest, Manfred Henningsen, and a special guest from Washington, D.C., Fazle Chowdhury, who has written the book Why Ukraine Matters. Welcome to you all. So let me start with you, Tim. We seem to more and more, we here at ThinkTech are right to dwell on what is going on in Eastern Europe. And in fact, there was a really interesting story in today's New York Times about how the conservative wing, ultra conservative wing in the House was now trying to link further support to Ukraine to cultural issues. So little by little, the Ukraine experience is affecting everything in the world. And this means that Putin must be very embarrassed by having the insurrection, the rebellion from Prigozhin and the Wagner group. So can you talk about how that fits in Russia? What kind of reaction we expect he would get, what kind of reaction we expect he is getting in Russia, and how it is revealing itself?
Good morning, Jay. I think Putin perceives himself as the grand chess master. I mean, remember, chess is very important in Russia. And I think as a former KGB agent and being in power for all these years, that he really does think of himself as a chess master. And I think he's perceived by his fellow Russians as a strategist. This invasion into Ukraine was the opposite of that. It was not well thought of, ill planned, and it's a disaster. And then you have this mutiny, if you will, from Prigozhin. And boy, does he even look worse because he fled Moscow, unlike Stalin, who stayed in Moscow. And now he's trying to repair by trying to, his speeches imply national unity. He's a man of the people. You saw him immediately come back and press the flesh with those in the street. Putin is a germaphobe, by the way, and I'm sure that was very painful for him to do that. He basically stated that there was a traitor in the midst and there would be an investigation. And then he reversed himself. All is forgiven, all is well. In the meantime, I think what he's trying to do is a very quiet, silent purge. Generals are missing. Getting to the bottom of why Prigozhin was granted easy access on the roads to Moscow. And so he's got a real problem on his hand. And to further complicate the problem for Putin, he's got to address the fact that Russian Air Force were killed by Prigozhin troops. Not only that, but Prigozhin came out with explicit statements that this war was unjustified. Even mentioning the word war in Russia is a criminal offense. And nothing to say about how weak Putin looks right now to his fellow Russians.
Yeah, Manfred, you could say the truth will out, even just, despite the propaganda. So, Manfred, are the wheels coming off?
Well, I think we have to wait for that, and this suggestion that Prigozhin had been killed is a little bit premature. But what you can really say is that Putin's image has been damaged in an extraordinary way. This image of his being in charge of everything has become destroyed. So we don't know what power he still has, even though he is obviously still in charge. But what power does he have is a question. Now, this war has brought something out that people, I think, have not talked about a lot, and that is this really paranoid nationalism, Russian nationalism in the society as a whole. There's a book out by a British scholar, Jade McGlynn, Russia's War. And when you read that, it makes you really become very, very nervous about that this Russia, and it will not change if Putin suddenly vanishes, being killed or goes into retirement or whatever. And then there was another book coming out, The Generation Z, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. When you read that, it's even more scary because there you have this nationalism being sold to the youth of Russia in a way that is incredibly comparable to Nazi Germany. The youth organizations in Putin's Russia resemble the Hitler Youth. And the ideological rhetoric, that they are imbibing is absolutely sickening. And all of the prejudices that you find in the QAnon in the United States, against homosexuals, against blacks, against immigrants, they are all there. And the war in the Ukraine is a war against not simply this upstart Ukraine, it's a war against the West. That's how it is sold.
Yeah. Fazle, I wanna ask you, what so far we've kind of touched on this notion that Putin has developed a strategy, and sometimes this strategy would allow for the ostracism of Prigozhin in Belarus. Sometimes he criticizes the generals or investigates them or makes them disappear for extended interviews, maybe very extended. And sometimes he commends them. So it seems to swing from one side to the other. And he has sort of a carrot and stick approach so far. Am I right about that? Am I right that he's trying to use the press, the propaganda, in a way so to keep everybody unbalanced?
I think you're almost there, Jay, in context that he's using whatever he can under his set of resources, but he seems to be miscalculating what he has full control over and what he thinks he has full control over. Let's understand a few facts here, is that one of the things that he also got wrong was the real capacity and the capability of the Russian military. He also somehow miscalculated the capability and the capacity of the Wagner Group. Now, it turns out that the Wagner Group has had more success than the Russian military. Now, that is an important thing to consider. And if he did not consider that, then perhaps all the drama that we've seen in the course of the last couple of weeks may not have happened. And they shouldn't have happened because of the fact that not only are the Russian military under direct siege, because now, as you understand, Ukraine is actually launching a counterstrike. And that counterstrike, when it does materialize, will show a true impact of not only what the potential and the capacity of Ukrainian troops are, but also how well Russian troops can defend. And I don't think the latter will work.
Tim, the last news on the Wagner Group is that they have been asked to turn their weapons in, that Putin wants them to disarm and turn their weapons over to the Russian military. And that suggests that the Wagner Group is no longer going to be involved in the war against Ukraine. How does that change the calculus?
Well, if that's true, if they have turned in over all their weaponry, a tremendous calculation. I mean, they were effective in Ukraine, extremely effective. It was brutal. I mean, it was basically many of the Wagner groups were basically cannon fodder, but they were making progress in their advances. So if they've turned in those weapons, I don't know if the Russian army has it within themselves to be successful in Ukraine.
Manfred, we have going on pretty much at the same time, the meeting in Vilnius. which is very interesting because Joe Biden has made statements to the effect that he thinks the war is already won. The Ukraine has won the war. NATO has said it's going to, redouble its efforts in armaments, it's really all a kind of slap in the face to Putin. Putin had a counter forum in Moscow, by the way, even though he can't leave Russia right now and be arrested. And I wonder what the meeting in Vilnius means to Putin.
It certainly emphasizes again the miscalculation of Putin as a political leader. What he has really accomplished is not only not conquering Kiev, in 2 days, but uniting the West in a way it was never united before, and making countries like Finland and Sweden join. I mean, even Erdogan has now accepted the membership of Sweden, while he gets some goodies for that support. But nevertheless, Vilnius simply underlines the total geopolitical catastrophe of Putin's thinking. But that is one thing. The other thing is that I think this nationalism that I mentioned before, this Russian xenophobic, racist Russian nationalism has not gone away. I mean, we always emphasize the refugees and all of the people who seem to be against Putin. Well, the most prominent ones are either dead or in prison, like Navalny. So for that reason, I think the miscalculations, the geopolitical miscalculations of Putin have simply become so obvious by the failure of the Russian military in the Ukraine, and by the unification, of the West. Now, there's one funny thing that you should also mention. I mean, people never talk about it. Why are Prigozhin's troops called the Wagner Group? I mean, Prigozhin is not only a culinary chef, he is also a friend of music. He named them after Richard Wagner. So maybe Putin should have watched more Wagner operas in order to understand, what was going to happen.
Well, Wagner was noted as sympathetic to the Nazis. He was a symbol for the Nazis, wasn't he?
Yeah, but I mean, look, he was dead, so he was not sympathizing with them. He couldn't from his grave, but he has been interpreted that way. But it's quite a fascinating thing. Everybody talks about Wagner, and they do not realize that it's Richard Wagner, the opera composer, that is really giving his name to this military expeditionary corps.
It's really interesting that you raised that. So, Fazle, I want to look wider here, because it's not just that we here know, what is happening, and we can analyze it, but the world knows. And what happened, in this insurrection is world news, all the way from China to Latin America, everywhere, and certainly in the U.S. Congress. And so I wonder, what the reaction of the world is, and how they might see Putin differently, and whether they think he may have lost it somehow, and how he is responding on the world stage to try to retain, his apparent power.
Well, it's obvious to me that the Russian president is very weak at this particular time, and he's becoming overly dependent on his one key ally, which is China. And this is actually a dangerous move, as I see it, because before, Russia was not the junior partner to China, but now they most firmly are. And what this also means is that Russia has to become much more dependent on its other allies primarily Belarus, other allies in Kazakhstan. And I'm not so sure that they can afford to be the junior partner after so long of being the ones who've been really directing traffic in terms of how geopolitics works out both in Europe and in Central Asia. Now, what's interesting is that, yes, the president of Russia is weak, but he's not out. And if he was going to be out, we would have seen Prigozhin take him out most indefinitely, because it certainly seemed like, with all the analysis that was being placed there in news outlets, even through major media houses, that he was very upset with the way how he was treated, how the Wagner group was treated by the Russian military and its generals. And I really think at the end of the day, his fight was not against the Russian president. His fight was really against the Russian generals that were really not supporting him like the way he wanted. But again, to answer your question, all this means is that the allies that Russia had before February 24th, 2022, now they will certainly, you will start to see cracks in how they behave towards the Russian president.
Yes, and Tim, it's all about timing, isn't it? It's been 2 weeks since this happened more. We haven't seen Putin, melt down. Haven't seen him make remarkable aggressive statements. You haven't seen any umbrella murders on the street, but you do see the possibility of that happening as we go forward. And so it strikes me that Putin is, he's ticked off for sure, and he's laying out some kind of strategy to deal with his adversary, deal with anybody who speaks against him. And the number of those people actually is increasing, I think, in Russia. But what kind of timing are we talking about? Is he going to act immediately, or is he going to delay it? His background with a KGB suggests that you lay in wait and then you ambush people later on. You think that's going to happen here? When are we going to see his plan unfold against his adversaries?
Well, I think there's a vacuum of information. He may well be engaged in his plans right now, and that is what I suggested earlier on. Is there may well be a purge in play right now. Certainly for him to ferret out who not spoke out against him, but who hasn't supported him. And I'm sure the fact that Prigozhin was able to get as far within 125 miles of Moscow speaks volumes to the lack of support the military was putting out there at that time. That, in Putin's mind, is unforgivable. And I'm sure some of these generals we may never hear from again. We'll see. So timing is probably happening right now, but I'll say for the record, I'm speculating on that, but I think it's happening. And second point, I'd just like to address something Manfred said is it's not only Prigozhin who's in this fantasy fairyland strategy or philosophy about his role, and certainly with Wagner, but I think Putin, this whole thing, this invasion of Ukraine is directly correlated to the fact that I think Putin thinks he's the reincarnation of Peter the Great, and he wants to restore Russia to the former glory of that which Peter the Great had. And I think that plays a role on how he approaches his presidency and his reign of terror in Russia.
He may not be in the same proximity to Peter the Great as he might have been before.
Well, he was born in St. Petersburg. I think it had an influence.
Manfred, from the start of this war, Putin has threatened people. He's threatened nuclear weapons on a variety of occasions. And of course, he actually has blown up the dam. And there are these conflicting signals as to the possibility of an accident, a nuclear accident in Zaporizhia. So I'm wondering whether you think that's part of Putin's bag of tricks here. Are we going to see threats like that again, or actually, as in the case of the dam, actual carrying out of those threats by Putin in order to distract attention, because distraction is got to be, it has always been, distraction has got to be an element of his plan to save face.
Well, I think the nuclear threat is at this point still off the table. And I think China plays a major role in that, having made it clear to Putin. I mean, Xi Jinping had made it clear to Putin that that is not an option. But you see, what is so amazing about Putin's mind, there are two aspects that I think should be mentioned. Number one, he has this vision, of a greater Russia going beyond the Soviet Union, going to Catherine the Great, Peter, and all the czars, crazy and normal ones before them. So you have this Russian vision, but on the other hand, you should never underestimate the paranoia of that guy. And this paranoia started when he was KGB officer in Dresden, in Germany, in East Germany. October 1989 is really important, because in October 89, you have not only protests in East Germany, and at one point, his office was threatened to be stormed. What saved him was something very interesting. He had learned perfect German. And so he went out and talked to the protesters and talked them out of storming his office in Dresden, and redirected him, well, indirectly, you could say, to go to the Stasi headquarters in Dresden. But the other thing is, that really made him paranoid anyway, the threat of civil society. But what was even more important, in that same month, you had an agreement between the East Germans and the West Germans for letting 10,000 East German tourists who were stuck in the garden of the West German embassy in Prague to get on trains from Prague to West Germany. But the people in East Berlin, in the GDR, insisted on having East German trains transport these people. So what you have is East German trains going to Prague, and the 10,000 or so people get on these trains, and then they had to go through the GDR, and wherever they were, thousands of East Germans wanted to get on that train. And it culminated in Dresden, in the railway station. When the train arrived there, the train was stormed. And Putin saw all of that. And for him, if there is something that is worse than nuclear weapons, is an enraged civil society. And that's why, he keeps Navalny, who was the only guy, who was capable of organizing mass rallies during the election campaigns in Moscow, to keep him in prison. He cannot kill him. If he dies, he does not know what happens in Russia. If people, remember the end that we saw of the Navalny documentary, when he was asked, what should we do if you die? And he said, continue.
Yeah, I remember that. We're going to move on to Fazle now with one other thing. So this has a profound effect on Europe. And Europe, one way or the other, shows signs of fragmentation. I speak mainly of La Belle France, with these protests, violent protests in the streets. And I wonder what effect you think the mutiny, the insurrection, the rebellion in Russia 2 weeks ago has on the people and the governments of Western Europe. It would seem from Vilnius that it brings them together, but I'm not sure. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, a lot has been said about how the West has become more united over Ukraine, but I would also like to add that the West has also silently have had disagreements, and they've kept that disagreements private. And one of the key individuals who've kept this disagreement or his disagreement in private is Macron. If you remember, right after the Ukraine invasion, there was a lot of talk about even Macron and even Olaf Scholz of Germany trying to negotiate with Putin even before the war to come to some settlement. And that failed. And what had happened after the invasion is that both Scholz and Macron has gone to China to figure out a way to detour some kind of a maneuver to create a peace process. Now, keep in mind, these governments have continued their businesses with Putin. Yes, there are sanctions, but yes, there are other items where trade continues. And to your point on how this is going to reflect in France, well, France was already divided after Macron made his stand. If you remember, the leftist parties gained strength in the mid parliamentary elections. Now it seems that after this recent protests in France, you will have more upheaval in the parliamentary process. I don't see Macron's stand actually becoming stronger. He was weak. He's going to become weaker. And even on the world stage, let's not forget that he was kind of shunned away from China when he tried to make some kind of overture towards Xi Jinping. He was not exactly in the best footing when it came to making sure that he was on the right side with, or even the good side of.
So what happens if we cannot rely on France anymore?
Well, you'll have to rely on the United States and Germany. For in Europe, it would have to be Germany, because Germany is in fact the key and probably the main muscle that can assist Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, be it in diplomacy, be it in military aid. It is the only power that can do that. Yes, it will be aided by other countries like Sweden and Britain, but really, it falls on Germany's shoulders at the end.
Mm. So, Tim, we talk about propaganda, and propaganda is also, it's not only in Russia, but it's outside of Russia. What can Putin do? What is he doing in the way of sending messages out? And has his propaganda strategy changed over the past couple of weeks in any notable way?
Great question. Remember the tenets of propaganda, and one of the tenets of propaganda is the big lie. Well, I think every Russian knows that since it's illegal to say that they're engaged in a war, the word war with Ukraine is illegal. Therefore, it's not happening. It's a police action. That's the big lie, and I think every Russian knows it's a farce. And I think that hurts Putin in his strategy of his propaganda to expect and continue to think that I've got everyone fooled to not believing that this was an aggressive war against Ukraine. Everyone knows differently.
Well, remember that Prigozhin said there's no good reason for this war. He made
exactly, and that's a huge blow to his credibility. Yes,
yeah,
a huge blow to his credibility as a strong leader and one of the men of the people. You don't lie to your people.
Yeah. So, Manfred, you're an emeritus professor of political science, and one of the most interesting things now is that the extreme conservatives in the House are trying to link the culture points with support for Ukraine. How is this working? Will it succeed? And how will it affect the whole affair?
There's one thing I wanted to say to Tim's comment about Russians thinking, that's not believing the propaganda. I think that's not true. When you read this book by Jade McGlynn, which just came out, Russia's War, it is absolutely stunning to read this affirmation of this maddening nationalist rhetoric that people in Russia, the majority, according to him, according to her, believe in.
Don't you think that there's a certain weakness now, that maybe some of them are rethinking that?
No, it has nothing. It's not so much the support of the war in itself. It is the Russian nationalism. And you see, your question about the conservatives, the Republicans in the House, what is so intriguing is that their conservative arguments are the arguments that the Russian nationalists have against the West. So you have a similarity there between the madness of Russian nationalists who are against the West and the madness of radical conservative Republicans in Congress. They share the same agenda. They think about this white supremacy replacement ideology. They think about anti-religious, anti-Christian arguments. They talk about homosexuality. They are in a way, twins, ideological twins. And it is very, very scary when you see the similarity. Now, when it comes to Germany, yes, I think Germany is the core of the European Union. It would have been good if, you have a greater understanding between Scholz and Macron, the way that you had between Macron and Merkel up to a certain point. I mean, Merkel has to be blamed for a misunderstanding of Putin to some extent as well, but she is out of office and we're waiting for her memoirs. They will be very interesting to see how she deals there with her complicity in the gas deliveries, from Russia. But in Germany, you have right-wing and left-wing people who are not happy about the Western position against Putin. It's really bizarre when you watch that, in German media, how they seem to be.
It probably makes Putin happy to see divisiveness in Germany or in the U.S.
Given them money also for a long time.
Yeah, we got to go to final comments here. So I'd like to ask Fazle to start with a round of final comments, and you can say anything you want, Fazle, but you might want to consider saying what you think will happen going forward.
Well, it's very difficult to predict, but what I anticipate is, there has been a lot of analysis on the welfare or even the survival of the Russian president. And yes, there is so much narrative on the fact that, yes, he's trying to be Peter the Great, but I think he wants to take a few layers up from Stalin, to be honest with you. He wants a greater Soviet Russia back from the grave. And I think as he does that, he is self-destructing himself. And I think it's really a shame how far he has taken Russia since the time he took office. And what will be really a shame would be that he'll be remembered for this abysmal war that he has conducted, that will only end in failure. And it has probably taken Russia back beyond the last 20 years and even more.
Thank you, Fazle. And Tim, is this going to make it easier to settle the war? Is there a possibility that Putin might actually change his position, or is that beyond reality?
Well, I think he's painted himself a bit in the corner. He's trying to maintain that constant image that he's the strong leader. And strong leaders, especially if they're Russian, they don't like to change their position or change their minds because it implies that they're weak. And that's what he looks like, because he changed his position about Prigozhin. He was a traitor, and now he's not a traitor. that looks incredibly weak, I think, to certain aspects of the Russian population, particularly the military. You'll see explicit statements in his speeches trying to reinforce his position as a strong leader, but you'll see very quiet under the radar actions. And in great Russian tradition, you'll see silent purges. And to not only silence the opposition and feed his paranoia, but also to intimidate future suspicions of insurrection or non-loyalty to the great Putin.
Very good point. Manfred, what are your thoughts? What would you like to leave with our audience on all of this?
The future is very unpredictable. And whatever happens to Putin, I am not willing to take any bets. But his position has become weak. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in his environment who are conspiring, to get him killed or replaced. For Putin, remember, Ukraine does not exist. The Ukraine was simply an appendix to Russia. And for that reason, negotiations with him getting an armistice or peace will lead nowhere.
No, it's hard to figure out what's going to happen. But
Ukrainians will not accept.
Somehow, Manfred, I feel that within one or the other of the Wagnerian operas, maybe The Ring of the Nibelung, there will be the answer to all of this. And if we study the Wagnerian operas, we may find what was really on Prigozhin's mind in naming his group the Wagnerian group, and we will find out what the answer is, but not today. Manfred Henningsen, retired emeritus professor from UH in political science. Fazle Chowdhury, author of not one book, but a number of them. And the one we're thinking of is Why Ukraine Matters, and it surely does more and more. And Tim Apicella, who is familiar with all these things because he attends these shows and he has some great input on all of them. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please click the like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Check out our website, thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.